For a long time, I thought the only way to get people to say yes was to become more persuasive. I believed I needed better arguments, better communication skills, or some kind of hidden trick that could change people's minds. So I consumed everything I could find about persuasion. I read books, watched videos, listened to experts, and tested these ideas in real conversations. But something kept bothering me. Sometimes people would say yes almost instantly, even when my arguments weren't very convincing. Other times, they would reject a perfectly logical idea without even thinking about it. I didn't understand why until I started studying psychology. That's when I discovered that most people don't say yes because they were convinced. They say yes because they want to stay consistent with who they believe they are. Once you understand this principle, you'll stop trying to force people to agree with you and start creating situations where saying yes becomes the most natural decision they can make. From then on, you'll never look at persuasion the same way again. So let's talk about one of the most powerful psychological principles ever discovered. To understand this principle, we first need to understand something about human nature. Most people believe that every decision is based on logic. We like to think we carefully analyze the facts, weigh the pros and cons, and then make the best possible choice. But psychology tells a very different story. Our decisions are influenced by something much deeper than logic, our desire to remain consistent with who we believe we are. Consistency is one of the strongest psychological forces driving human behavior. Once we publicly express an opinion, make a choice, or commit to even a small action, our brain starts treating that decision as part of our identity. At that point, changing our mind becomes surprisingly uncomfortable, not because someone is forcing us to stay consistent, but because inconsistency creates discomfort. Instead of seeing our decisions as isolated actions, we begin to see them as reflections of who we are. And once something becomes part of our identity, we're naturally motivated to protect it. That's because people don't just want to appear consistent to others. They also want to feel consistent with themselves. Take honesty as an example. If someone sees themselves as an honest person, they'll often feel uncomfortable after telling even a small lie, not because someone caught them, but because that action conflicts with the person they believe they are. The same psychological process happens with commitments. When we freely choose to support an idea, express an opinion, or take even a small action, our brain quietly updates the way we see ourselves. That subtle shift changes everything. Future choices are no longer influenced only by the facts in front of us. They're also influenced by the identity we've already started building. And the stronger that identity becomes, the stronger the desire to behave consistently with it. This is why commitment is so powerful. It's not because our previous choice controls us, it's because we naturally want our actions to match the person we believe we are. But there's an important question. If this psychological force is really that powerful, can it actually change people's behavior in measurable ways? Psychologists decided to find out. To test this idea, researchers Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser designed a remarkably simple experiment. It would later become one of the most famous studies in the history of persuasion. They divided participants into two groups. The first group received a single request. The researchers asked if they would place a large "Drive carefully" sign on the front lawn of their home. It wasn't a small sign. It was large, unattractive, and impossible to ignore. As you might expect, most people refused. There was simply too much to ask from someone who had never made any previous commitment. But the second group had a completely different experience. Before asking for the large sign, the researchers made a much smaller request. They simply asked participants if they would display a small sign supporting safe driving. It was quick, easy, and seemed so insignificant that most people agreed. A short time later, the researchers returned. This time, they made exactly the same request they had made to the first group. Would they place the large "Drive carefully" sign on their lawn? The difference was remarkable. The people who had first agreed to the small request were far more likely to accept the larger one. So why did it work? The researchers hadn't become more persuasive. The second request hadn't changed. Nor had the participants suddenly begun to care more about safe driving. The only thing that had changed was the participants themselves. That small commitment had quietly reshaped the way they saw who they were. After agreeing to the first request, many began seeing themselves as the kind of people who supported that cause. And once that identity had been established, saying yes to the larger request became the most natural way to remain consistent with it. That single experiment demonstrated something extraordinary. Sometimes, changing a person's behavior doesn't begin with changing their mind. It begins with changing how they see themselves. So how do you actually apply this principle? The answer isn't simply asking for a smaller favor first. It's creating a commitment that people naturally want to stay consistent with. But not every commitment is equally powerful. According to psychologist Robert Cialdini, the strongest commitments share a few important characteristics. First, they must be voluntary. People need to feel that the decision was entirely their own. The moment someone feels pressured or manipulated, the desire to remain consistent becomes much weaker. Second, commitments become more powerful when they're active rather than passive. Signing a petition, answering a question, making a public statement, or taking a small action creates a much stronger psychological effect than simply thinking about doing something. And finally, public commitments tend to be even more effective. Once people express a position in front of others, they're naturally motivated to behave in ways that remain consistent with it. This brings us to one of the most effective persuasion techniques ever discovered, the foot in the door technique. It works by creating a small commitment before asking for a larger one. Instead of asking for a large commitment immediately, you begin with a small one. If you need someone's help, don't ask them to spend an entire afternoon helping you. Start by asking for a quick opinion or 5 minutes of their time. If you want someone to support a cause, don't begin by asking for a donation. Ask them to sign a petition or publicly express their support first. That initial commitment changes something much more important than their answer. It reshapes their identity. But you can make this principle even more powerful. Before asking for a commitment, reinforce the identity connected to the behavior you want. If you need help, remind the person that they're reliable, generous, or always willing to support others. Or even better, encourage them to describe themselves that way. The key is getting people to publicly identify with the trait. Once they do, they're no longer just answering a question. They're making a commitment to that identity, and that makes future behavior much more likely to stay consistent with it. For example, instead of telling someone they're helpful, ask questions that encourage them to identify themselves that way. Once they do, they're much more likely to act consistently with that identity and follow through on your request. That's the real lesson behind the commitment and consistency principle. People don't stay consistent because they're forced to. They stay consistent because they want their actions to match the person they believe they are. At the beginning of this video, I said I used to believe that getting people to say yes was all about becoming more persuasive. But psychology reveals something much more important. Persuasion isn't just about changing someone's mind. It's about understanding how people see themselves. Once you understand this principle, you'll stop trying to become more persuasive. Instead, you'll start creating situations where saying yes becomes the most natural decision they can make.